Chapter 34. The Yankee and the King sold as slaves. Well, what had I better do? Nothing in a hurry, sure. I must get up a diversion, anything to employ me while I could think, and whilst these poor fellows could have a chance to come to life again. There sat Marco, petrified in the act of trying to get the hang of his Miller gun, turned to stone, just as the attitude he was when my pile driver fell, the toy still gripped in his unconscious fingers. So I took it from him and proposed to explain its mystery. Mystery, a simple little thing like that, and yet it was mysterious enough for that race and that age. I never saw such an awkward people with machinery. You see, they were totally unused to it. The Miller gun was a little double-barreled tube of toughened glass with the neat little trick of a spring in it, which, upon pressure, would let a shot escape. But the shot wouldn't hurt anybody, it would only drop into your hand, and the gun were two sizes. Wee mustard seed shot, and another sort that were several times larger. They were money. The mustard seed shot represented mill rays, the larger ones, mills. So the gun has a purpose, and very handy, too. You could pay out money in the dark with it, with accuracy. You could carry it in your mouth or your vest pocket if you had one. I made them of several sizes, one size so large that it would carry the equivalent of $1. Using shot for money was a good thing for the government. The metal cost nothing, and the money couldn't be counterfeited, for I was the only person in the kingdom who knew how to manage a shot tower. Paying the shot soon came to be a common phrase. Yes, and I knew it would still be passing men's lips way down in the 19th century, yet none would suspect how and when it originated. The king joined us about this time, mightily refreshed by his nap and feeling good. Anything could make me nervous now, I was so uneasy, for our lives were in danger, and so it worried me to detect a complacent something in the king's eye, which seemed to indicate that he had been loading himself up for a performance of some kind or another. Confound it, why must he go and choose such a time as this? I was right. He began straight off in the most artful and transparent and lubberly way to lead up to the subject of agriculture. The cold sweat broke out all over me. I wanted to whisper in his ear, "Man, we are in awful danger. Every moment was worth a principality till we got back these men's confidences. Don't waste any of this golden time." But of course I couldn't do it. Whisper to him? It would look as if we were conspiring. So I had to sit there and look calm and pleasant while the king stood over that dynamite mine and mooned along his damned onions and things. At first the tumult of my own thoughts, summoned by the danger signal and swarming to the rescue from every quarter of my skull, kept up such a hurrah and confusion and fifing and drumming that I couldn't take in a word. But presently, when my mob of gathering plans began to crystallize and fall into position and form line of battle, a sort of order and quiet ensued, and I caught the boom of the king's batteries as if out of remote distance. Were not the best way, methinks, albeit it is not to be denied that the authorities differ as concerning this point, some contending that the onion is but an unwholesome berry wind-stricken early from the tree. The audience showed signs of life and sought each other's eyes in a surprised and troubled way, whereas others do yet maintain with much show of reason that is not necessarily the case, instancing that plums and other like cereals do be always dug in the unripe state. The audience exhibited a distinct distress, yes, and also fear. Yet are they clearly wholesome, the more especially when one doth assuage the asperities of their nature by a mixture of the tranquilizing juice of the wayward cabbage. The wild light of terror began to glow in these men's eyes, and one of them muttered, "These be errors, every one. God hath surely smitten the mind of this farmer." I was in miserable apprehension. I sat upon thorns. And further instancing the known truth, that in the case of animals, the young, which may better be called the green fruit of the creature, is the better, all confessing that when a goat is right his fur doth heat and soar and game his flesh, the which effect taken in connection with his several rancid habits and fulsome appetites, and godless attitudes of his mind, and bilious qualities of morals. They rose and went for him with a fierce shout. "The one who would betray us, the other is mad. Kill them! Kill them!" They flung themselves upon us. What joy flamed up in the king's eye! He might be lame in agriculture, but this kind of thing was just his line. He had been fasting long, he was hungry for a fight. He hit the blacksmith a crack under the jaw that lifted him clear of his feet and stretched him out on his back. "St. George for Britain!" and down the wheelwright. The mason was big, but I laid him out like nothing. The three gathered themselves up and came again and went down again and came again and kept on repeating this with native British pluck until they were battered to jelly, reeling with exhaustion, and so blind that they couldn't tell us from each other. And yet they kept right on, hammering away with what might was left in them. Hammering each other, for we stepped aside and looked on while they rolled and struggled and gouged and pounded and bit, with the strict and wordless attention to business of so many bulldogs. We looked on without apprehension, for they were fast getting past the ability to go for help against us, and the arena was far enough from the public road to be safe from intrusion. While they were gradually playing out, it suddenly occurred to me to wonder what had become of Marco. I looked around and he was nowhere to be seen. Oh, but this was ominous. I pulled the king's sleeves and we glided away and rushed for the hut. No Marco there, no Phyllis there. They had gone to the road for help, sure. I told the king to give his heels wings and I would explain later. We made good time across the open ground, and as we darted into the shelter of the wood, I glanced back and saw a mob of excited peasants swarm into view, with Marco and his wife at their head. They were making a world of noise, but that couldn't hurt anybody. The wood was dense, and as soon as we were well into the depths, we would take to a tree and let them whistle. Ah, but then came another sound. Dogs. Yes, that was quite another matter. It magnified our contract. We must find running water. We tore along at a good gait and soon left the sounds far behind and modified to a murmur. We struck a stream and darted into it. We waded swiftly down it in dim forest light for as much as 300 yards, and then came across an oak with a great bough sticking out over the water. We climbed up on this bough and began to work our way along to the body of the tree. Now, when we began to hear those sounds more plainly, so the mob had struck our trail. For a while the sounds approached pretty fast, then another while they didn't. No doubt the dogs had found the place where we had entered the stream and were now waltzing up and down the shores trying to pick up the trail again. When we were snugly lodged in the tree and curtained with foliage, the king was satisfied, but I was doubtful. I believed we could crawl along a branch and get into the next tree, and I judged it worth a try. We tried it and made a success of it, though the king slipped at the junction and came near failing to connect. We got comfortable lodgment and satisfactory concealment among the foliage, and then we had nothing to do but listen to the hunt. Presently we heard it coming, and coming on the jump, too. Yes, and down both sides of the stream. Louder, louder. The next minute it swelled up into the roar of shoutings, barkings, tramplings, and swept like a cyclone. I was afraid that the overhanging branch would suggest something to them, said I, but I don't mind the disappointment. Come, my liege, it were well that we could make good use of our time. We flank them. Dark is coming on presently. If we can cross the stream and get a good start and borrow a couple of horses from somebody's pasture to use for a few hours, we shall be safe enough. We started down and got nearly to the lowest limb when we seemed to hear the hunt returning. We stopped to listen. Yes, said I, they're baffled. They've given it up. They're on their way home. We will climb back to our roosts again and let them go by. So we climbed back. The king listened a moment and said, They still search. I wit the sign. We did best to abide. He was right. He knew more about hunting than I. The noise approached steadily, but not with a rush. The king said, They reason that we were advantaged by no parlous start on them, and being on foot, as ye are net no mighty way from where we took to the water. Yes, sire, that's about it, I'm afraid, though I was hoping better things. The noise drew nearer and nearer, and soon the van was drifting under us, on both sides of the water. A voice called a halt from the other bank and said, And they were so minded they could get into yon tree by this branch that overhangs, and yet not touch the ground. Ye will do well to send a man up it. Marry, that we will do. I was obliged to admire my cuteness in foreseeing this very thing and swapping trees to beat it. But you don't know there are some things that can beat smartness and foresight. Awkwardness and stupidity can. The best swordsman in the world doesn't need to fear the second best swordsman in the world. No, the person for him to be afraid of is some ignorant antagonist who has never had a sword in his hand before. He doesn't do the thing he ought to do, and so the expert isn't prepared for him. He does the thing he ought not to do, and often it catches the expert out and ends him on the spot. Well, how could I, with all my gifts, make valuable preparation against a nearsighted, cross-eyed, pudding-headed clown who would aim himself at the wrong tree and hit the right one? And that is what he did. We went for the wrong tree, which was, of course, the right one by mistake, and up he started. Matters were serious now. We remained still and awaited developments. The peasant toiled his difficult way up. The king raised himself up and stood. He made his leg ready, and when the comer's head had arrived in reach of it, there was a dull thud, and down the man went, floundering to the ground. There was a wild outbreak of anger below, and the mob swarmed in from all around, and there we were treated and prisoners. Another man started up, the bridging bough was detected, and the volunteer started up the tree that furnished the bridge. The king ordered me to play Horatius and keep the bridge. For a while the enemy came thick and fast, but no matter. The headman of each procession always got a buffet that dislodged him as soon as he came in reach. The king's spirit rose as his joy was limitless. He said that if nothing occurred to mar the prospect, we should have a beautiful night. For on this line of tactics we could hold the tree against the whole countryside. However, the mob soon came to that conclusion themselves, wherefore they called off the assault and began to debate other plans. They had no weapons, but there were plenty of stones, and stones might answer. We had no objections. A stone might possibly penetrate to us once in a while, but it wasn't very likely. We were well protected by boughs and foliage, and were not visible from any good aiming point. If they would but waste half an hour in stone throwing, the dark would come to our help. We were feeling very well satisfied. We could smile, almost laugh. But we didn't, which was just as well, for we should have been interrupted. Before the stones had been raging through the leaves and bouncing from the boughs 15 minutes, we began to notice a smell. A couple of sniffs of it was enough of an explanation. It was smoke. Our game was up at last. We recognized that. When smoke invites you, you have to come. They raised their pile of dry brush and damp weeds higher and higher, and when they saw the thick cloud begin to roll up and smother the tree, they broke out in a storm of joy clamors. I got enough breath to say, "Proceed, my liege, after your manners." The king gasped, "Follow me down, and then back thyself against one side of the trunk and leave me to the other. Then we will fight. Let each pile his dead according to his own fashion and taste." Then he descended barking and coughing, and I followed. I struck the ground an instant after him. We sprang at our appointed places and began to give and take with all our might. The pow-wow and racket were prodigious. It was a tempest of riot and confusion and thick-falling blows. Suddenly some horsemen tore into the midst of the crowd, and a voice shouted, "Hold, or ye are dead men." How good it sounded! The owner of the voice bore all the marks of a gentleman. Picturesque and costly raiment, the aspect of command, a hard countenance with complexion and features marred by dissipation. The mob fell back humbly like so many spaniels. The gentleman inspected us critically, then said sharply to the peasants, "What are you doing to these people? They be madmen, worshipful sir. They have come wandering, and we know not whence. And you know not whence? Do ye pretend ye know them not? Most honored sir, we speak the truth. They are strangers and unknown to any but in this region, and they are the most violent and bloodthirsty madmen that ever— Peace, ye do not know what you say. They are not mad. Who are ye, and whence are ye? Explain." "We are but peaceful strangers, sir," I said, "and traveling upon our own concerns. We are far country and unacquainted here. We have purposed no harm, and yet but have your brave interference and protection from these people would have killed us. And you have divined, sir, we are not mad, neither are we violent or bloodthirsty." The gentleman turned his retinue and said calmly, "Lash me these animals to their kennels." The mob vanished in an instant, and after them plunged the horsemen, laying about them with their whips and piteously riding down such as were witless enough to keep the road instead of taking to the brush. The shrieks and supplications presently died away in the distance, and soon the horsemen began to straggle back. Meantime, the gentleman had questioned us more closely, but had dug no particulars out of us. We were lavish of recognition of the service he was doing, but we revealed nothing more than that we were friendless strangers from a far country. When the escort were all returned, the gentleman said to one of his servants, "Bring the led horses and mount these people." "Yes, my lord." We were placed toward the rear among the servants. We traveled pretty fast and finally drew rein sometime after dark at a roadside inn, some 10 or 12 miles from the scene of our troubles. My lord went immediately to his room after ordering his supper, and we saw no more of him. At dawn in the morning we breakfasted and made ready to start. My lord's chief attendant sauntered forward at that moment with indolent grace, and said, "Ye have said ye should continue upon this road, which is our direction likewise. Wherefore my lord, the Earl Grip, hath given commandment that ye retain the horses and ride, and that certain of us ride with ye 20 mile to a fair town that high Camemnet, when so ye shall be out of peril." We could do nothing less than express our thanks and accept the offer. We jogged along, 6 in the party, at a moderate and comfortable gait, and in the conversation learned that my Lord Grip was a very great personage in his own region, which lay a day's journey beyond Cabinet. We loitered to such a good degree that it was near the middle of the forenoon when we entered the market square of town. We dismounted and left our thanks once more for my lord, and then approached a crowd assembled in the center of the square to see what might be the object of interest. It was the remnant of the old peregrinating band of slaves, so they had been dragging their chains about all this weary time. That poor husband was gone, and also many others, and some few purchases had been added to the gang. The king was not interested, and I wanted to move along, but I was absorbed and full of pity. I could not take my eyes away from these worn and wasted wrecks of humanity. There they sat, grounded upon the ground, silent, uncomplaining, with bowed heads, a pathetic sight. And by hideous contrast, a redundant orator was making a speech to another gathering not 30 steps away, in fulsome laudation of our glorious British liberties. I was boiling. I had forgotten I was a plebeian. I was remembering I was a man. Cost what it might, I would mount the rostrum, and click! The king and I were handcuffed together. Our companions, those servants, had done it. My Lord Grip stood looking on. The king burst out in fury and said, "What meaneth this ill-mannered jest?" My lord merely said to his head miscreant coolly, "Put up the slaves and sell them." Slaves. The word had a new sound, and how unspeakably awful. The king lifted his manacles and brought them down with a deadly force, but my lord was out of the way when they arrived. A dozen of the rascals' servants sprang forward, and in a moment we were helpless, with our hands bound behind us. We so loudly and so earnestly proclaimed ourselves freemen that we got the interested attention of that liberty-mouthing orator and his patriotic crowd, and they gathered about us and assumed a very determined attitude. The orator said, "If indeed ye are freemen, and ye have nothing not to fear, the God-given liberties of Britain are about ye for your shield and shelter." Applause. "Ye shall soon see. Bring forth your proofs." What proofs? "Proof that ye are freemen." Ah, I remembered. I came to myself. I said nothing. But then the king stormed out. "Thou'rt insane, man. If it were better and more in that reason that this thief and scoundrel here prove that we are not freemen." You see, he knew his own laws just as other people so often know the laws, by words, not by effects. They take a meaning and get it to be very vivid when you come to apply them to yourself. All hands shook their heads and looked disappointed. Some turned away, no longer interested. The orator said, and this time in tones of business, not of sentiment, "And ye do not know your own country's laws. It were time ye learned them. Ye are strangers to us, and ye will not deny that. Ye may be freemen, we do not deny that, but also ye may be slaves. The law is clear. It doth not require the claimant to prove that ye are slaves. It require you to prove that ye are not." I said, "Dear sir, give us only time to send to Astralat, or give us only time to send to the Valley of Holiness." Peace, good man, these are extraordinary requests, and you may not hope to have them granted. It would cost much time and would unwarrantably inconvenience your master. Master, idiot, stormed the king. I have no master. I myself am the... Silence, for God's sakes. I got the word out in time to stop the king. We were in trouble enough already. It could not help us any way to give these people the notion that we were lunatics. There's no use in stringing out the details. The Earl put us up and sold us at auction. The same infernal law had existed in our own South in my time, more than 1,300 years later, and under it hundreds of freemen who could not prove that they were freemen had been sold into lifelong slavery without the circumstance being made any particular impression upon me. But the minute law and auction block came into my personal experience, a thing which had been merely improper before became suddenly hellish. Well, that's the way we're made. Yes, we were sold at auction like swine. In a big town in an active market we should have brought a good price, but this place was utterly stagnant, so we sold at a figure which makes me ashamed every time I think of it. The King of England brought $7 and his Prime Minister $9, whereas the King was easily worth $12 and I is easily worth $15. But that is the way things go. If you force a sale on a dull market, I don't care what the property is, you're going to have to make a poor business of it, and you can make up your mind of it. If the Earl had enough wit to... However, there is no occasion for my working my sympathies up on his account. Let him go for the present. I took his number, so to speak. The slave dealer bought us both and hitched us onto the long chain of his, and we constituted the rear of his procession. We took up our line of march and passed out of Cambenet at noon, and it seemed to me unaccountably strange and odd that the King of England and his chief minister, marching manacled and fettered and yoked, of a slave convoy, could move by all manner of idle men and women, and under the windows where sat the sweet and the lovely, and yet never attract a curious eye, never provoke a single remark. Dear, dear, it only shows that there is nothing diviner about a king than there is about a tramp after all. He's just a cheap and hollow artificiality when you don't know he's a king. But reveal his quality, and dear me, it takes your breath away to look at him. I reckon we are all fools, born so, no doubt.